people. The people will ultimately decide what's put out as a resolution.
Okay. Gary Sullivan, resident of Port Chester, New York. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it, and it is a great turnout. My main question, and it's more for research, and I'll certainly do it, but you said it in your statements that you've done a few of these, which is great. Obviously, we like experience. Can you give us a couple examples? And nothing's alike. There's nothing like the town of Rye. Understood. Which is a great thing, too. But can you give us maybe one or two examples of similar studies you've done so I can look at them, and also what the resolution was?
It probably won't surprise you to hear that for all of the studies, all of the communities that have taken on this question and actually put resolutions to their voters as to whether it's ballot measures to their voters, whether it's dissolving a village, whether it's consolidating a town with a neighboring town, consolidating a city in a town is another model that's in process upstate. Very few consolidations or dissolutions have actually occurred. I'd say it's probably 10 to 1 for those communities that have pursued it compared to those that have actually pushed things over the edge. And I think one of the real reasons for that is, people may have certain feelings about their town or village today. They may not like the tax rate. They may think that there are inefficiencies. But that devil that you know tends to be a lot better than the devil you don't. And questions like, how do I know my services will continue to be provided? How do I know the police will continue to be out there, that the streets will continue to be plowed and paved and so forth? You know that stuff happens today compared to what might happen if things restructure. So that's the real fundamental challenge to kind of pushing these consolidation or dissolution efforts over the edge. Where we see our organization having a role, and again, not being wedded to dissolution, consolidation, or opposed to it, is trying to bridge that knowledge gap, to show you with some real granularity how services that are provided today would be provided. What is the exact model? How would we staff it? What are the service implications? What are the shifts in terms of taxes? Where are the potential efficiencies, right? We take what is typically an abstract conversation about, well, if we all merge, we can save 10%, right? We take that abstract conversation and try to bring it down to the concrete level. Some communities have leveraged that analysis to actually move forward on consolidation. One example that our organization has been involved with twice now is the village of Seneca Falls, which on January 1st of 2012, in just a few months, will become the largest village in New York State history to dissolve itself. Basically, they're merging the village and town government there. We did a study for them about 4 years ago where we modeled what a Seneca Falls community would look like if the village dissolved. What would the impact on taxpayers be? How would services continue to be provided, and so on. We basically did that upfront feasibility study. And as a result of that feasibility study, officials in Seneca Falls a year later called us back in and said, write the plan for us. Voters have said they want this on the ballot, write the plan for us. So we wrote the plan for them, and voters in the village ultimately approved it. So Seneca Falls is one example. Okay. Some significant differences between Seneca Falls and your community here and other communities across the state. But there are a lot more examples of communities that have actually gotten to the altar and put the question to voters. And voters have ultimately said, you know what, 5% potential savings, it's not enough for me to bridge that gap. And I mentioned during my presentation how different communities respond to, answer the question about should we or shouldn't we consolidate differently. I'll give you one example. We have worked in communities, Seneca Falls being one example, where some government restructuring or consolidation has ultimately happened with an estimated savings to taxpayers of 10%, 12%, something like that. We have worked in other communities where the measure has gone to voters where the projected savings is 27%, and voters have defeated it. Dollars and cents are an important part of the consideration, but what we've learned throughout working in all these communities is it's only one consideration, right? So the type of service, who's providing the service, the level of service, the guarantees if we consolidate or restructure, those are all important components, and that's why our analysis will try to hit on each of them.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Great answer. Thank you.
Hello. Robert Infantino, Rybrook. I would like to see Rybrook become a coterminous town village for one reason: we could appoint our own assessor. The present assessment process is, I would say, a lot of pseudoscientific hocus pocus, smoke and mirrors. It is completely illogical. I think the village of Rybrook is much more competent to conduct its assessment of all our properties. Chief Justice Marshall once said, "The power to tax is the power to destroy." Well, I think the power to assess is in the same category. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Randy Robinowitz. I'm the Rye-Town section of the Village of Mamaroneck. I just want to say that I thought this was a very thoughtful approach in the right direction. I just checked out the website, and it was very insightful. However, I wanted to ask if the slides that we saw, which were the baseline, beginning of the baseline report, could be put on the website, because it's very informative. I think people, when they see how much is spent in each department and how so much of it overlaps, I think people might get more impassioned about doing something. Thank you.
Yeah, we can certainly put today's slide presentation on the website. And as I said before, when that slide was up, that's one snippet of a table that I think spans 3 pages in the baseline report. So there'll be considerably more detail as the table is finalized, and obviously make sure the public has access to that. Thank you.
I'm John Hofstadter. I'm a trustee with the Village of Mamaroneck, and I want to thank you all for doing this. I think it's extremely valuable and could be very beneficial to the community, all of the communities. One of my observations listening to this and reading the material online is it doesn't seem as if the idea of dissolving the villages and keeping the towns and providing the services was looked at. And it seems to me that that would be probably the easiest to achieve legally because of New York state law, and also because looking at the consolidation and shared services of various departments, having served on the Village of Mamaroneck and Village of Larchmont and Town of Mamaroneck committee looking at similar things, it was determined that because of the various differences between our uniform services contracts, that we could not, even if we wanted to, merge the services together, because the unions would have to agree to it. And the unions typically are not going to agree to lessen their power or reduce their workload and reduce their staff. So what it turned out to be was we determined that the only solution would be to remove one layer of the government, and the easiest layer seems to be to remove the villages. Being a village trustee, it's probably unusual for people to be promoting that idea, but it seems to me that that's the best way to save that more than 10% that would be necessary for people to feel that there's a value here. And on top of that, we have the 2% tax cap that we're going to be faced with, which is going to put pressure on the villages as well to provide the same level of services at substantially reduced. I mean, I would imagine that most of the villages are going to be hindered by the fact that our salary increases and pension benefits and all of those other things are going to impact our budgets. So we're actually going to be providing similar services, if not less services, for the same amount of money. So, I mean, it's in looking at the DPW and the police contracts when we were evaluating, I was part of that committee, there was no way that the other communities would share services with us because our contracts were considered to be too rich. Another observation in general is, in looking at the audience, there seem to be, there are not a lot of younger families out here, people represented who, because it's a Saturday morning, I'm giving up soccer with my daughter, coaching her team right now to be here. So I would encourage you to try and have some other meetings that people can attend, because I think it's very important that it be a cross-section of the community that, speaks about this issue. And you asked about, one of the slides that you showed was referring to what Randy was speaking about. Perhaps we could look at a per capita analysis of that as well, you know, a head count versus amount expended, and also if you could break out, I think the Village of Mamaroneck, Rhinebeck portion, which I grew up in, so I'm very familiar with this issue. Grew up in Mamaroneck Village, Rhinebeck, and now live in the Village of Mamaroneck, the town of Mamaroneck. Can you break out a 40% roughly population and factor that in? Because that's really what would have to happen. You'd be looking at 40% of the population of the Village of Mamaroneck that is in Rhinebeck. And maybe even based on the tax value of the tax property, and do a comparison that way. Because doing it based on the total population of the Village of Mamaroneck doesn't really give you an analysis of anything. So, just a couple of observations.
If I can just respond to one of the questions that you raised. The RFP, the request for proposal, and the work study plan specifically provides that the one alternative that's not being looked at in this study is the dissolution of the villages. And it was discussed among the members of the steering committee for a reason being the fact that we felt that even though if you were to start today to form layers of government, getting rid of villages and having a town take over, perhaps that would be the way to go. But what was said by Joe before is the identity and the local services, and I have to speak on behalf of the Village of Rybrook. I would think it's fair to say that Village of Rybrook incorporated almost 30 years ago, and I do not think that there would be an appetite at all from speaking to residents to dissolve the village, especially since the essential services are provided by village employees and there is an identity. So we felt the fact that there would not be, and I don't want to use the word political viability because I'm nonpartisan in Rybrook, but let's say the viability to dissolve. And that's why we decided to, at least for step number one, to take on this analysis. Also, the cost of looking at all the other alternatives would have been much greater as well. But that was thought about and it actually was discussed. And quite honestly, Supervisor Carvin wanted to study that alternative, but we really felt that I think you understood the viability of that was probably, given our communities, not really feasible at this time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. When I first started in commercial banking, I joined Manufacturers Hanover Trust, for those of you who remember Manufacturers Hanover Trust. There was Manufacturers Hanover Trust, one of the 6 largest commercial banks in the world at the time. Bank of America was number 1, Citibank was number 2, Chase was number 3, JP Morgan was number 4, Chemical was number 5, and Manhattan was number 6. Since I left, I'm not sure what to put in my resume because Manufacturers Hanover merged with Chemical Bank, merged with Chase Bank, and merged with JP Morgan, which now most of you know is JP Morgan Chase. So 4 of the largest 6 commercial banks in the United States merged and became one, and that's the only way they were able to survive and generate efficiency. So I was prepared to look at a more far-reaching study along the lines that we talked about, but I think the fair to say the mayors and Mayor Feinstein, as she expressed, were of the view that that wasn't really a viable option. There wasn't the support in the communities for that, so we should focus on this first step, get the community conversation going, get it done with objective analysis and numbers, and we all agreed to do that. And that's what we're going to support.
Peter Feynman from Portchester. I'd just like to make a Manny-Hanny comment since you brought that up. Back in the days when I was working in banking, we heard the story that after Manufacturers and Hanover merged, that since each company used different color files, that you could identify an employee even after the banks merged if they used, let's say, red files or blue files for their folders. So mergers take quite a lot of effort. But the question I want to ask first is, what is the relationship of the city of Rye to this program? As was pointed out, in 1942 it broke away, and cities are completely independent of towns and the villages. And as your slide so clearly shown, and which we all know from our own personal experience, the city of Rye divides the town of Rye. So if you're talking about consolidation, it makes it much more difficult if this huge section in the middle is not part of that process. So this may be part of the uniqueness of this. It's not just that the Rye Neck is part of a village that's in the Mamaroneck, it's also physically separated. So while it might be nice to have cooperative services for ambulance, I think we all would realize if there was one town, including Rye, the city, it would make police, fire, and a lot of other services a lot more efficient, and we may pay a price if the city is not part of this in any way or doesn't choose to cooperate in any way. And a second comment I'd like to follow up on, you mentioned something about identity earlier, and the villages wouldn't want to disband. Well, schools, as you pointed out, are not part of this. They're separate from municipal. But schools are a strong part of how people form their identity. If you were to ask people, where do you live, they're more likely to think of where they went to school, where their kids go to school. We had a soccer coach here. There's football, of course. There are high school bands that have national attention. These are a strong part of your identity. And if I understand schools are not included in this, but if there's still going to be a Rye Neck school system, let's say, or these other school systems, then that will strengthen the local identity, and how does that fit in? So those are the two areas of concern I'd like to bring up.
Thank you.
I'm happy to take the Rye City question, or even offer Susanna Keith. I don't know if the opportunity to come up as well. But basically, Rye City, as we discussed, opted out of the town of Rye in the early 1940s, as Mayor Feinstein said, and became a city. I know on an informal basis we work very closely with Rye City, and the principal link is on the Rye Town Park Commission, where Mayor Pilla, Mayor Feinstein sit, as do myself. And the Rye City has two members of the Rye Town Park Commission. If we were to dissolve the town of Rye, one of the things that we'll have to come up with a solution for is very clearly a reconfiguration of the Rye Town Park Commission. Mayor Rosenblum is anxious to come onto that commission, also to represent the Rye Neck section of the Village of Mamaroneck. So I think that's clearly one of the things that CGR will be looking at in terms of the city of Rye. We've been working very closely on an informal basis. They're not a formal participant because it was only tangential that they were going to be formally involved, and that's at Rye Town Park. The second question, though, about identity, I think, Joe, I don't know if you or anybody else wanted to mention. Yeah.
My sense is that was more a comment. Okay. But you know, I don't disagree. You know, this community is, and you're obviously all much more familiar with the history of it than I am. But this community is like pretty much every other that I've worked in across New York State. I mean, there is you ask people where the village border is. Nobody knows. You ask people what their school mascot is, and they pretty much all know. So there's a real affinity for the school district, and there's always a history behind that. So I appreciate the point being raised and that tie of identity to the districts. Thank you.
Still good morning. Ben Maloro, Hillcrest Avenue. I don't think it's been mentioned that there are two sections of Rye Brook. The affluent District 5 and the general public middle and low income District 4. I just want to bring that out because there's quite a discrepancy. Secondly, a few months back I listened to the meeting with Mr. Carvin where he wants to get rid of the Rye Town Garage, which is owned by the three communities, for 3 acres of land up in Rye Brook. Yeah, it's like $2 million worth of property for practically nothing, and it's alleged that eventually the 3 acres of land will go with Crawford Park, which I don't think is too good idea. He also wanted to sell the village rooms in Portchester, which holds the court and all the administrative business. I think it would be a big hardship for the communities, or both, because this is being ignored, never even mentioned, especially that the three communities own everything. Thank you.
Sure, go ahead, please.
I just want to comment that I think what Ben was alluding to, that Rye Brook has two different sections that we talk about. It's one community, but the fact is, and this is the confusion, that there are two school systems. and then the northern portion is the Blindbrook school system, and in the southern portion it's the Portchester school system. And that is one of the conundrums or the difficulties as far as we talk about identity, but we are one community, Rybrook, but there are two different school systems, the northern and then the southern.
Just on the two...
But I can't say that, you know, as far as the demographics, I don't have that in front of me, that between two sections. I look at Rybrook as one community. I've always looked at it as one community, irrespective that there are two school districts.
I just want to say that most of the housing that's being proposed is in District 4, which is the Portchester School District. Rybrook, District 5 pays nothing for the kids that have come out of these developments. This is what angers me the most. I mean, there's a big difference. There's two projects by the state that are being put up, one on Barber Place, and was it? I forget the second. Ellendale Avenue, by the same contractor. There was two different representatives, actually. But Last Construction, who is your consultant, and I think is a conflict of interest, that he's proposing all these different things in District 4 and nothing in District 5. You mentioned about school districts. I mentioned at one of our meetings is that the Blindbrook High School sent a letter to my neighbor who was Hispanic about recruiting their son to their high school. And he asked me why. I said, because they have no minorities in District 5. Thank you.
It's not part of the discussion. For clarification, there are no state projects. Ben was talking about affordable housing, which is done by independent developers, and no one from the village of Rybrook, no consultants and the like, are advocating where, in fact, those developments should be. They're done by private developers who come before the village.
I'd also like to take the opportunity to clarify the 2 points made about the town of Rye. The first is that we're selling the garage for parkland. No decision has been made. There are ongoing negotiations and discussions with Mayor Feinstein and the village of Rybrook. And again, in the same spirit of cooperation, we're trying to rationalize the utilization of assets of the town of Rye and the village of Rybrook, but no decision has been made. And quite frankly, I think as part of this study, they'll probably be delayed until things can be made more clear. In terms of selling 10 Pearl Street and lacing it back or simply selling it, I'm not going to make any apologies for trying to reduce tax expenditure. I'm not going to make any apologies for trying to reduce the absolute cost of government to an absolute minimum. It is, however, I would clarify again, it's a study. Again, given the fact that we're looking at the dissolution and that the results of the study should be ready for April, I would expect that that would be held off as well, because presumably if you did dissolve the town of Rye, you'd have to figure out how you dispose of those assets. Now, what I will do is coordinate with CGR and the steering committee to see if we want to coincide those processes, because it may aid in the analysis of the financial analysis of that. So, but again, obviously, especially those of us in the town of Rye are tasked with the difficult challenge of managing the town of Rye through this very difficult climate of change. And in fact, I'd like to take 10 seconds or a minute here just to talk about the employees of the town of Rye. The employees of the town of Rye have done an absolutely fantastic job and worked extremely hard for the last 4 years. And there's 18 employees in the town of Rye, and I want to commend them for their service. And at the end of the day, are there things we can improve? Of course there are. But they have to go through this period of uncertainty as well. They have to figure out, am I going to have a job at the end of 2 or 3 years? And we have to try and manage the town of Rye in this period of uncertainty. So it is a difficult challenge, but there's no decisions made on those two other issues.
I'd like to throw one comment out.
Actually, if I may real quick, respectfully, I would just, as you're suggesting, just not act on disposing of any assets before the study, because the disposition is a big part of the study.
Absolutely.
I think it should be noted, it's been noted in several publications before, but in spirit of what we were talking about initially that Joan mentioned of all the municipalities working together, there's a term that has not been used lately throughout the United States, and that is a statesman. And I would personally like to thank Joe Carvin, because he is a statesman who I believe is one of the only elected officials who is working hard as hell to eliminate his own job.
Mario Nardi, Rybrook. former trustee there at its inception.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
We've talked about this for years, about becoming coterminous town village. And my question is, since there are so many pieces to the puzzle here, if, let's say, Portchester, Rybrook, and the rest, well, the town as a whole votes in favor of dissolving the town and forming the respective town villages. And let's say then in Mamaroneck, because we have to take care of Ryeneck, it's defeated as it was once before. Mamaroneck tried to become a town village, a coterminous town village some years ago, and Portchester, I mean the town of Rye voted in favor of it. We were willing to give them away, but the people, I believe, mostly in the unincorporated area, didn't want them. So we may have a repeat of that. Does that then disrupt all the options that we have, or will your study take into consideration a what if?
The answer is the latter. It has to take into consideration the what if. So whether a vote to not approve some restructuring happens, whether or not that kills the whole process for those maybe other areas that do approve a restructuring, depends on the actual ballot question, depends on the model that's put to the community. If you put to the community, say, a simultaneous creation of, let's just say, 3 coterminous town villages, right? So village voters in all 3 villages are simultaneously voting on creating those coterminous town villages. It is effectively a triple referendum. You've probably heard of the concept of dual referendum. One of the reasons why consolidations in New York State and in other places are so challenging. You talk about consolidating a city and a town, right? You need a majority in one jurisdiction and a majority in the other jurisdiction. And even if you get 100% in one jurisdiction, if it loses by 1 vote in the other, the whole thing is killed, right? It depends on whether that situation happens here, depends on the model that ultimately, if a model goes on the ballot, depends on what that model is. So I think part of our role here, as we sketch out options, is to look not just at the all for one, one for all model, where we essentially have a triple referendum, but to look at what if. What other options are available? Could we do, say, a coterminous vote in Rybrook and Portchester, and at the same time do another restructuring to address Ryeneck, right? It depends on the model that's put before the voters.
But if you would have to, I don't know how the sequence of the referendum would take place, but you would have to have a vote to dissolve, maybe a simultaneous vote to dissolve the town of Rye and form the coterminous villages there. Now, what happens if that goes through, but the Ryeneck is left without a home because the town of Mamaroneck won't accept them, and if the village of Mamaroneck goes for coterminous themselves and it gets defeated because I believe the whole town votes on that.
Yeah, correct. If I can interject for one moment, for transparency and pragmatic, exactly what you're talking about process, while the town of Mamaroneck did not vote to join this group, Josh Mandel from the village of Larchmont is very interested, and he is being kept aware totally of this. There were 3 coterminous votes that were turned down. It was passed by the Ryeneck section of the town of Rye. It was passed by the town of Rye and defeated because of the vote, quite honestly, in the town of Mamaroneck. The town of Mamaroneck has a great deal of interest in maintaining the village of Mamaroneck as, if nothing else, as a great tax base. The village of Larchmont, in discussions with Josh Mandel, believe it or not, is extremely interested in also at the same time creating a coterminous vote where the village of Mamaroneck would become an independent town and the village of Larchmont would become an independent town. This changes the entire dynamics of the vote in the town of Mamaroneck between the village of Mamaroneck section of the town of Mamaroneck, which is the majority and including the village of Larchmont, if the voters so choose, it would pass tremendously. So that is one option. We don't know if it's going to happen, but it's something that's out